In 2010, DreamWorks blew open what we thought we knew about animation's possibilities and limitations with the film How to Train Your Dragon. With this film, DreamWorks managed to display a gargantuan scale and epicness possibly unsurpassed in animation. After the final installment in 2019, it seemed that DreamWorks had closed the door on this franchise, which was a relief to fans to see it wouldn't get milked for content into ruin. But in early 2023, fans were surprised by the Universal announcement of a live-action adaptation in the works. Though the announcement has some fans excited, it has many more fans asking, why? And is there any way this adaptation can actually work? In order to answer this, let's ask a bigger question. What makes for a great live-action adaptation of animated stories? We need to be reminded of one principle echoed by animation legends that I mentioned in a previous video on animation, so let's consider this video a part 2 to that one. This principle is that animation is best used to tell stories that only animation can tell. It makes sense. Why tell a live-action story in animation if the story is best for live-action? This goes both ways and really for all mediums. Tell your story in the medium that is best for the strengths of that particular story. There's still some flexibility in this rule as we see some films turned into good stage plays, some should stay in theater, and animation inspiring good live-action films, but each medium brings something to the table for that story that other mediums will never have. Theater's live performance has an immediacy and a presence that films by nature simply can't have. Films have a flexibility with narrative and giant visuals that theater can't have, and a realistic, grounded tone animation can't have. The best animated stories are ones that take most advantage of the medium of animation, which is so much more flexible than live action by telling a story that would be impossible in live action, like Toy Story, Shrek, or Coco. These are beautiful in animation, but would be downright disturbing if tried in live action. Skeletons with eyeballs have been done before, and not as a charming kids movie. Similarly, as it's been noted, dolls coming to life is already a pretty common live-action horror trope. Not only would Shrek himself be disturbing, but everything that makes Shrek great wouldn't look great in live action. Some animated stories might technically be able to be done in live action, like The Iron Giant or The Incredibles, but the very best medium to capture the charm, fun, and energy of the stories was animation, so that's what they were made in. So let's ask, what room does How to Train Your Dragon have for a live-action treatment? I will admit that, yeah, many of the elements of the story would look pretty cool in live action, and that would give it some appeal. And maybe it would be regarded as a successful adaptation on that basis alone. But let's look at the story. The first movie is sort of an origin story for Hiccup. We're not jumping right into the middle of a hero's tale. The next two encompass the entirety of Berk's history with dragons and wraps it up all neatly by the end of the third film. From what we know, the upcoming film is more or less going over the plot of the first animated movie, which leaves me wondering, what could they possibly add that the first movie didn't have? I mean, cool, it's all the animation stuff but in real life. But I'm not seeing enough to make it not feel like a one-for-one empty remake. But second and more importantly, as for animation, there's no possible way that dragons, a slightly important element of the story, can be done full justice in a live-action movie. The animated version managed to essentially reinvent our modern culture's expectations for the cinematic and artistic portrayal of dragons, breaking the well-worn mold that movies and popular media made of dragons for decades, and artistically for even centuries. These movies' dragons successfully used animation to push the boundaries of character design into the fantastical, utilizing bizarre designs and bold shape language, and for the main cast, making highly caricatured shapes that somewhat mirrored the main cast's build and personalities. So how can you make a creature that looks like a chunky reptilian bumblebee in live action and make the audience take it seriously? Toothless isn't impossible to make in live action, but more importantly for him and the other dragons, there could only be a dim semblance of the expressiveness that animation empowers. Scenes like these simply aren't effectively replicable in live action with realistic-looking dragons. Reptiles just don't make anything like these movements or expressions in real life. This is important for Toothless as the emotion and expression he provides are important to the charm and personality of his character and key moments of the story. His relationship to Hiccup forms the core of the story, and since he can't say any words, his emotiveness is essential. With these things considered, a live-action version would likely leave us with a classic shot-for-shot remake, but with less fun, charm, and soul, and audiences would probably regard it as essentially another empty cash grab. That is, possibly unless they find a wildly different tone and approach for the story to fit the strengths of live action, like Disney did with Jungle Book. This movie is one of Disney's most successful live-action adaptations, and the reason might have as much to do with the source material as its execution. It was a good story because the original source material was possibly better geared towards live-action than animation. In fact, there have been quite a handful of live-action adaptations, the first of which predates the animated version by about 20 years. The tone of Rudyard Kipling's original story is quite dramatic and sometimes dark, lending itself perfectly to live-action.
What about me? Am I gonna be a fine wolf? Look at me howl.
In some packs, the runt gets eaten.
The reason the animated version worked is because it did a vastly different take on the story, fitting it into the strengths of animation and turning it into a fun and colorful musical. Plus, for live action, it helps that the story is anchored by a human main character, and this is the jungle. These animals are supposed to look a little disturbing or scary. Tarzan is another tale that can work in both a live action and animated version. The original novels are pretty dramatic and dark and fit live action pretty well. Again, hence the live action version spanning back to near publication date. Animated Tarzan pushes the story into the strengths of animation by also drastically changing the tone and adding colorful musical numbers, leaning into the characterization of the animals, and using animation to really push the dynamic, kinetic movement of Tarzan. But in stories like Lion King, this is more or less an original Disney film, a musical. So in the live-action version inevitably takes many of these out, but doesn't bother to change the story or the tone, the leftover song-lean version just kind of feels like a carbon copy, but less fun and charm, a little more dead in comparison. Sure, seeing the plot and the animals all fleshed out in photorealism is visually interesting, but the whole reason the original used animation for anthropomorphic animals was because animation is way better at giving animals emotion and expression. It also doesn't help that there's no human character to anchor this live-action tale. One main point of contention is that many of these popular original animated films have had iconic sidekicks and irreplaceable characters that can simply only be done in animation. If you want the soulless eyes and expressionless face of a fish to suddenly become emotional and provide an effective character, you simply have to use animation. Inevitably, when this character from The Little Mermaid was adapted to live action, it just didn't work because real fish look dead inside and there's only so much that voice acting can help. This crab is fun and emotive, but real crabs look soulless and kind of creepy. So the most Disney could do was basically just make it not as creepy, but there was really no room to make him very emotive in the confines of reality. Other characters like Mushu and Mulan were just too hard to tackle and had to be cut altogether. In Beauty and the Beast, we were shown that singing dishes and candles should only be attempted in animation because it just doesn't work in live action. If they did a live-action Tangled, the horse Maximus would have to be greatly reduced as a character with all his personality and expressiveness because the confines of reality wouldn't allow it for a real horse. It's the flexibility of animation that allows them to push character to the next level. I think it's also worth mentioning that the many voices saying that 2019's Lion King is really just another animated movie have a point. Every single shot of Lion King is computer generated, with the exception of only one, the opening shot of the sunrise. That would technically mean that WALL-E utilized more live-action footage than the Lion King. There's ultimately a tricky web of details that makes a live-action adaptation worth doing, and some of it just relies on good creative intuition, but essentially if there's no drastic changes in the story or tone to help it play into the strengths of live action, and the things that only animation can do well have to be severely altered or cut, then audiences will see it as basically a lifeless remake, an empty cash grab, or at best, meh. Maybe there's something highly unique and creative that Universal has planned for the movies that I'm not thinking of. In recent articles, they have essentially promised it will be its own thing. I would certainly like to be surprised, but I simply can't think of a way in which this works out and makes a welcome and sufficiently different experience to the animated movie. By effectively wielding the strengths of animation as a medium, the original movies simply have all the action, comedy, charm, and epicness that I could ask for in a movie experience. It's also a little sad to see Universal take DreamWorks' iconic stories and jump on the live-action remake bandwagon because they have a shot here to differentiate themselves from Disney. Disney live-action remakes get plenty of attention at the box office, but aside from a few well-regarded films, everyone kinda agrees that these films just represent Disney milking a formula that's proven to get box office results, not audience appreciation and positive brand reputation. It's a way of telling audiences they've got nothing more creative to offer, so they'll continue doing what's financially safe, although everyone knows this can't last forever, has to bottom out at some point. It's also a little odd that Universal is using a franchise that finished so recently. The last movie of the trilogy came out in 2019, only several years back. But everyone can see that part of Disney's strategy is that many of their live-action remakes come about a generation later, so that the adults who grew up cherishing the original will be compelled not only to watch the new ones themselves, but take their kids to watch it too and share in the nostalgia. It's nothing personal.
It's just good business.
For some reason, Universal decided to jump the gun and come in 20 years early. Ultimately, every film a studio releases is an opportunity to gain audience trust and brand loyalty, or the opposite. Everyone wants to come home at night after a long day at work and be swept away in a gripping tale, so I hope that either Universal can somehow pull off a miracle and make this a surprisingly fresh and original take on the animated story, or otherwise I hope they can refocus into telling more fresh stories we can root for that fit the medium for which they were intended.